The stellar vanguard cruised silently through the void, its engines humming as it sliced through the cold expanse of deep space. Commander Elise Vargo stood on the bridge, her eyes fixed on the shimmering display before her. The abyss, a vast, unexplored region of space, loomed ahead like a dark, uninviting ocean. She had heard of it in scientific reports, but nothing could prepare her for the unsettling sensation that washed over her as they entered its outskirts. It wasn't just the emptiness that made the abyss so intimidating. It was the unnatural stillness, the absence of stars, the way the edges of space seemed to warp and shift. And then there were the signals. At first, they were nothing more than strange pulses, short bursts of electromagnetic energy, nothing out of the ordinary for a region of space that had been untouched by exploration for centuries. But as the vanguard ventured deeper, the signals grew more complex, more organized. They were patterns, and they were coming from somewhere deep within the abyss. "Elise, you need to see this," Dr. Marissa Hayes called from the science console. The team of researchers aboard the ship had been investigating the signals, but the sudden change had caught their attention. Vargo strode over, eyes narrowing as she studied the fluctuating data on the screen. It wasn't just random noise. It was deliberate, almost as if something, or someone, was trying to communicate. "Can you pinpoint the source?" Vargo asked, her voice steady despite the nagging sense of unease creeping up her spine. "It's difficult," Hayes replied, tapping the screen as she adjusted settings. "The signal's origin is fluctuating, constantly shifting. It's almost like it's bending space itself. We've never seen anything like this before." Vargo paused, her instincts telling her to be cautious. There was something too unnatural about this place, something that didn't sit right. "Is it a distress signal? Are we sure it's not a trap?" Hayes hesitated. "It doesn't feel like a distress signal, but we can't rule it out. Whatever's out there, it's playing with the very fabric of space. It could be a trick to lure us in." Vargo glanced at the tactical officer. "Lieutenant, what's the status of our fleet?" "Everything's operational, Commander," the lieutenant responded. "The fleet's maintaining formation at a safe distance from the abyss." Vargo nodded. "Keep it that way for now. No one moves without my orders." As the stellar vanguard pushed further into the abyss, the strange signals became even more intense, almost rhythmic. It was as though something, or someone, was calling them. The silence in the bridge was palpable as the crew fell into an uneasy tension. Every member felt it, the sense that they were not alone. Suddenly, the calm was shattered. An explosion rocked the ship. The hull groaned as it was struck by an unseen force, sending alarms blaring throughout the deck. Vargo's grip tightened on the armrest of her chair as she steadied herself. Her eyes shot to the view screen, and what she saw made her heart race. The abyss was no longer empty. Massive shapes, vast and indistinct, loomed out of the distortion. They weren't ships, at least not in the traditional sense. They were like living shadows, flickering in and out of existence. Gravity itself seemed to warp around them, distorting the stars in the distance as their forms shifted. "All hands, brace for impact," Vargo shouted as the ship was rocked again, this time more violently. The bridge lights flickered, and the eerie hum of the ship's engines sputtered as power began to drain. "Commander," Hayes cried, "they're warping space. The signal, it's a lure, a beacon, a trap." The sudden realization hit Vargo like a cold wave. The signals hadn't been a distress call, they were a warning. And now, the stellar vanguard was caught in the web of something far older and more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. The abyss had no mercy, and it seemed humanity was about to learn it the hard way. "Captain, we've lost communication with the rest of the fleet," the communications officer shouted. Vargo's mind raced. The fleet was isolated. They were alone in the abyss, with only the unknown creatures from the depths to contend with. Her gaze snapped to the tactical officer. "Prepare the fleet to engage. Whatever they are, We won't go down without a fight. The stellar vanguard lurched violently again, its hull groaning as if protesting the weight of the gravity fluctuations tearing at it. The massive, shadowy shapes outside the ship's viewports twisted and reformed, stretching through the void like living nightmares. Commander Elise Vargo gripped the edge of her console as another explosion rocked the ship. This time, it wasn't just the hull that was damaged. The power grid flickered, plunging the bridge into darkness before emergency lights flared to life. The crew's faces were illuminated by the faint, ominous red glow. "Report," Vargo barked, her voice sharp. "Shields are holding, but barely," the tactical officer responded, his face pale. "We're taking fire, but we can't identify the weapon or its origin. It's like the ship's being torn apart from the inside." Vargo's mind raced as she surveyed the view screen, where the strange, flickering shapes outside the ship were no longer just distant anomalies. They were closing in, fast. "Lieutenant, initiate evasive maneuvers," Vargo ordered. "Get us out of their firing range." The ship's engines roared to life as it jerked to the side, attempting to veer away from the approaching dark masses. But the movements were sluggish. Something was disrupting the ship's power. The gravitational forces outside were increasing, pulling at the vanguard like a predator to its prey. "Commander, we've lost propulsion in the aft thrusters," the engineering officer reported. "The distortion is too strong. We're dead in the water." A chilling silence fell over the bridge as the gravity wells outside tightened, drawing the ship further into their reach. Vargo's chest tightened. There was no escape. Then the void outside seemed to crack open as a new immense shape materialized in front of them, its form shifting and writhing like a mass of dark smoke made solid, with glowing pinprick eyes scattered across its surface, gazing at them from every angle. It was massive, far larger than the Vanguard. An alien ship, or perhaps something more. Its surface was not metal, but pulsating as if it were alive, responding to the gravitational tides of the abyss itself. "We've got company," the tactical officer said, his voice trembling. "They're surrounding us." A pulse of energy shot out from the shadowy mass, striking the Vanguard's shield. The blast wasn't explosive. It felt like a compression wave, as though the very air was being squeezed out of the ship. Systems shorted out across the bridge as lights dimmed again, and an eerie hum filled the air. "What the hell was that?" Vargo growled, steadying herself. Her eyes never left the screen. "Energy signature detected. It's coming from inside the ship," the communications officer reported, his voice edged with panic. Before Vargo could respond, the emergency alarm sounded, signaling a breach in the hull. Her blood ran cold. Some force, was slipping through the very fabric of the ship. "Seal all doors," she commanded, her voice steady despite the growing terror. But it was too late. A shape appeared on the bridge. It flickered in and out of existence, no more than a silhouette at first, a human-like figure made of shifting blackness, its outline defined by a faint otherworldly glow. For a moment, Vargo's breath caught in her throat. The creature was taller than any human, its form jagged and amorphous, like something that didn't belong in this reality at all. The creature's head tilted as if studying the crew. Its presence seemed to warp the very air around it, making everything feel colder, heavier. Vargo could feel it, an overwhelming sensation of despair creeping into her mind, as though the creature was pushing its thoughts into hers. "Commander, what is that?" Hayes whispered, fear lacing her voice. "I don't know," Vargo said through clenched teeth, "but it's not like anything we've ever seen before." The creature stepped forward, and as it did, the space around it shimmered, warping like a mirage. Its long, appendage-like limbs reached out, and Vargo saw them flicker in and out of existence, each movement seeming to tear the air apart. Before anyone could react, the creature extended one hand, a jagged appendage of pure darkness, and placed it against the side of the Vanguard. The ship's hull screamed as if the creature's touch were burning through it, twisting the material, reshaping the very metal of the ship. "The ship is losing integrity," shouted the chief engineer. "The hull's been compromised." With the sense of time itself unraveling around them, Vargo's pulse quickened. These were no ordinary aliens. The Voidborn, as they would later be known, were not just invaders. They were ancient beings of the abyss itself. They had powers that bent the laws of physics, twisted the fabric of space, and were now making their move. The Vanguard was trapped, isolated, and under attack. As more dark shapes materialized, Vargo understood one harsh truth. Humanity had just become the hunted. "Prepare for impact," Vargo shouted, trying to rally her crew. "We fight to the last, no matter what." But the enemy outside only grew larger. The battle for survival had begun. The ship groaned as the stellar Vanguard was jolted once again. The bridge lights flickered, casting an eerie glow across the tense faces of the crew. Commander Vargo stood at the center of it all, her mind racing as the magnitude of the situation sunk in. The Voidborn, these creatures from the depths of the abyss, were unlike anything humanity had ever faced. "Status report," Vargo commanded, her voice sharp. "We're holding together, Commander, but just barely," the chief engineer, Lieutenant Tessa Byrne, said, her voice strained. "Hull breaches are being sealed, but the ship's internal systems are deteriorating rapidly. The distortion from the Voidborn is affecting everything. Our propulsion, weapons, even life support. We're operating on backup power now." Vargo's jaw tightened. The ship was crippled, and the fleet was still cut off from them. There was no retreating from this battle. The abyss had become their prison, and the Voidborn their executioners. But there had to be more to this. The creature that had appeared on the bridge. It wasn't just a soldier. It was a messenger. A warning. These creatures had planned this, and they wanted something. "Dr. Hayes," Vargo said, turning to the lead scientist who had been analyzing the Voidborn's energy signatures. "What can you tell me about these beings? Do they have any weakness?" Hayes' face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she navigated the science console. "The Voidborn aren't like any alien species we've encountered. They're not just biological, at least not in the way we understand. I think they're entities from beyond our dimension. They exist in multiple planes at once, and the distortion we're experiencing is their way of interacting with our reality. They can manipulate the very fabric of space-time, and possibly even time itself. But it's not just power. They've been waiting for something." Vargo's brow furrowed. "Waiting for what?" "I don't know," Hayes whispered, eyes wide. "I've been analyzing their signals, and there's something I can't quite understand. It's almost like a message, but it's fragmented, broken. It's almost as if they were trying to reach out, trying to make contact long before we ever entered the abyss. And now that we're here, they know we're not just explorers. They know we're a threat to their existence." The thought sent a cold shiver down Vargo's spine. The Voidborn had known they were coming. And more than that, they were aware of humanity's potential. They weren't just invading. They were preparing for a war. Before Vargo could respond, the communications officer, Ensign Rios, shouted, "Commander, we're picking up something. Another signal. It's too close." The signal came in bursts, rhythmic yet haunting. It pulsed through the ship's systems, making the walls vibrate with a low hum. It was louder now, not just a message but an overwhelming presence that seemed to seep into their very minds. Hayes quickly adjusted the frequency, but the signal seemed to pulse with an energy that defied comprehension. "Can you isolate it?" Vargo demanded, her voice hard, fighting against the growing unease in her chest. I don't know," Hayes stammered. "It's like it's bypassing the ship's systems. It's not just a signal. It's affecting our minds. It's..." Suddenly, the bridge lights flickered and then went dark. The ship's artificial gravity wavered as if it, too, were being pulled into the Voidborn's influence. The eerie hum of the abyss was louder now, surrounding them, drowning out all other sounds. And then Vargo felt it, the pressure in her skull, the weight of something pulling at her thoughts, trying to tear them apart. "Commander," Hayes whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's happening again. I can't stop it." Vargo gripped the edge of the console, trying to steady herself. "Focus, Hayes. What's happening?" Hayes looked terrified, her eyes wide as she stared at the screen. They're speaking. Not with words, but with intent. "I can feel it, Commander. They're not trying to communicate the way we do. They're warping our minds, showing us fragments of something." "Fragments of what?" Vargo demanded, as a sudden vision flickered across her own mind. Flashes of black skies, endless voids, and massive creatures with eyes like burning suns. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was awake or trapped in a nightmare. "They're showing us the past," Hayes said, her voice trembling. "The Abyss wasn't always like this. There was a civilization here, one that tried to fight back against the Voidborn. But they failed. Their minds were broken, their bodies twisted by the Voidborn's influence. These creatures, they don't just conquer, they consume. Their power is more than just physical. They feed on thoughts, on the essence of life itself." Vargo's heart clenched. "So they're not just invaders, they're parasites." "They've been waiting for us, Commander," Hayes said, her voice trembling as her eyes locked onto Vargo's. "And now, they know we're vulnerable. They know we're afraid." Vargo turned toward the viewport, her hands clenched into fists. The shadows outside were closing in again, their forms shimmering and flickering in and out of reality. The signal, their signal, was growing stronger. The Voidborn were not just attacking the stellar vanguard. They were trying to break their very minds. "We need to fight back," Vargo said, her voice cold with resolve. "Whatever they want, we're not going to let them have it. They can warp space, they can bend minds, but they can't take our will. We'll break through this." The ship groaned again, and the crew braced themselves for the worst. The battle for their very sanity had only just begun. The stellar vanguard trembled under the strain as the Voidborn's influence grew stronger, its entire structure feeling as if it were being pulled in multiple directions at once. Every system aboard the ship groaned as though it was on the brink of collapse. But it wasn't just the ship's physical integrity that was failing, it was the crew's resolve. Commander Vargo stood firm at the center of the bridge, her mind battling the intrusion. The feeling of something slipping into her thoughts, invading her consciousness, was overwhelming. It wasn't just a force. There was something alive in it, something intelligent and hungry. The Voidborn weren't just attacking the ship. They were attacking the crew's minds, breaking them down from within. She could see it now, clearer than before. Flashes of impossible landscapes, black skies filled with jagged stars, and those terrible, alien eyes that haunted her every waking moment. The Voidborn were everywhere, their presence like a weight pressing on her chest. "Commander," Lieutenant Burns' voice was strained, but it was clear she was trying to fight it too. "The distortions are increasing. We can't hold out much longer. We need to act, or we'll lose the vanguard to them." Vargo's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the tactical console. Their shields were down to a fraction of their capacity, the weapon systems barely functioning. They were sitting ducks, surrounded by an enemy they didn't fully understand. "We don't have the luxury of time," Vargo said, her voice low and determined. "Can we get anything back online?" "I'm working on it," Byrne replied. "But the Voidborn's influence is scrambling the circuits. It's like they're inside our systems, sabotaging everything. We can't even get a message to the fleet." Vargo clenched her fists. "Then we'll do this the hard way." Before she could give the order to try and make an escape or prepare a counterattack, the bridge's lights flickered once more. The pressure in the room seemed to intensify, and the hum of the abyss grew louder, almost deafening. The crew winced, as if the sound were drilling into their very souls. Suddenly, a new figure appeared in the doorway to the bridge, its form barely visible against the shifting shadows. It was no longer a fleeting image. This one was solid, walking through the flickering darkness as though it belonged there. The creature was humanoid in shape, but its body was a grotesque mixture of shadow and sinew, with tendrils of dark energy extending from its arms. Its eyes, those haunting, glowing eyes, fixed on Vargo, and the crew felt the weight of its gaze as though it were attempting to pry open their very thoughts. "Commander," it spoke. The voice wasn't one of sound, but of thought, deep and reverberating, as though it came from the very void itself. Vargo felt the words in her mind, cold and alien, but with an undeniable command to them. "You have come to us. You cannot leave. You will be consumed, as all who enter the abyss are." Vargo swallowed, her mind screaming for control. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at the edges of her consciousness. The creature tilted its head. "We are the Voidborn. You are the last of your kind to arrive, but not the last to fall. Your minds are fragile. We will break them. We will make you ours." Vargo's pulse quickened as the reality of the situation settled like a weight on her chest. These beings weren't just invaders. They were something far worse, existences that transcended human understanding, parasites of the mind, drawing strength from fear and confusion. "You can break our bodies, but you'll never break our will," Vargo spat, the words more out of defiance than confidence. She could feel her heart pounding, the pressure of their influence squeezing tighter, but she refused to succumb. They'd wanted her to bend, to fear. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The Voidborn creature extended one long, gnarled arm toward her, and the air around it rippled like water disturbed by an unseen hand. The ship trembled again, and Vargo felt herself drawn toward the being. Her breath caught, and she had to fight not to scream as a cold, alien sensation wrapped around her thoughts. It was trying to speak to her, trying to control her. "No," Vargo whispered to herself, her hands clenched tight at her sides. She wasn't going to give in. Not now. Not ever. The creature's form flickered, and in the next moment it was gone, leaving only the lingering chill in the air. The pressure receded slightly, but the damage was done. The crew was shaken. They had seen it, felt it. The Voidborn were not just a physical enemy. They were an existential threat, attacking the very core of who they were. Vargo took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We can't fight them the way we fight others. They're not just flesh and blood. There's something more. We need to find a way to fight back against their influence. We need to reach the fleet, or we'll be alone in this." Her eyes turned to the science station, where Hayes was still working, her face pale. "Hayes, is there any way we can disrupt their signal? Block their influence?" "I'm working on it, but—" Hayes' voice faltered as she glanced at the console. "It's not that simple. Whatever they're using to manipulate us is outside our technological reach. We're dealing with something other. If we can't find a way to disrupt their energy field, we might all end up as broken husks of what we once were." Vargo's face hardened. "Then we'll make them regret ever coming here. Prepare whatever we can. We're not losing this fight." The Voidborn may have broken the Vanguard physically, but they hadn't broken humanity's will. Not yet. And that would be their downfall. The stellar Vanguard seemed to tremble with every beat of the Voidborn's pulse, its hull now more of a prison than a ship. Every system was struggling, life support barely holding, weapons offline, and even the most basic communication systems useless against the alien interference. But amid the overwhelming chaos, there was still one thing the Voidborn hadn't counted on: the unyielding human spirit. Commander Vargo paced the bridge, her mind spinning with options, none of them good. The crew had been pushed to their limits, each of them feeling the oppressive weight of the Voidborn's psychic influence. But they hadn't broken. They weren't defeated. Not yet. "Status?" she asked, her voice clear, though she could feel the pressure of the alien signal pressing against her thoughts. Lieutenant Byrne, the chief engineer, was at her console, frantically working. "We've managed to reroute some auxiliary power to basic functions," she said, glancing at the flickering screens. "I've isolated some of the Voidborn's interference, but it's a temporary fix. The moment they notice the disruption, they'll adapt." "Can we get weapons online?" Vargo asked, a last-ditch effort to turn the tide. Byrne's fingers danced across the keys, her expression tight with concentration. "Maybe, but it's not going to be easy. The Voidborn's energy signature is distorting the entire weapons matrix. Even if we manage to fire, it'll likely just phase through them. We need something that disrupts their energy at its core." Vargo's mind raced. She turned to Hayes, the ship's lead scientist, who was still at the science console, her eyes darting between readings. "Hayes, can you give us anything that'll stop them from just bending reality like this? I don't care if it's theoretical or experimental, just something." Hayes looked up, a flicker of something resembling hope in her eyes. "There might be something on the fringe of my research. It's risky, untested, and it'll probably only work once, but it could disrupt the Voidborn's energy field long enough to give us a shot at their vulnerability." Vargo didn't hesitate. "Tell me everything." "The key is the energy they're using. It's not traditional. There's a frequency, a resonance, at which their power collapses on itself. If we could generate a field of the opposite resonance, one that resonates with the same frequency but is destructive, it would destabilize their form temporarily. It's like tuning a radio to the wrong station and causing the signal to go static. But getting the right frequency is difficult." Vargo's eyes narrowed, her instincts screaming for action. "How long?" "I don't know. Maybe 30 minutes to set up the necessary adjustments, but we have to focus all remaining energy into a specific resonance generator. If we're off by even a fraction, it won't work, and they'll likely retaliate. Hard." A cold silence fell over the bridge as the crew absorbed the gravity of the situation. There were no guarantees, no second chances. It was all or nothing. Vargo looked around the bridge, meeting the eyes of each crew member. She could see the exhaustion in their faces, the way their bodies tensed with fear, but also something else, a spark, defiance. They weren't going to give up. They were humans, and if there was one thing that history had taught them, it was that humanity thrived in the face of impossible odds. "Get to work," Vargo said, her voice unwavering. "This is our only shot." The crew sprang into action, each of them moving with the urgency of someone who knew there was no tomorrow. Byrne and her team worked quickly to repurpose the ship's remaining power, shifting energy from auxiliary systems to power the makeshift resonance generator. Hayes dived into her data, adjusting frequencies and calibrating the device as best as she could, her mind consumed by the task. As the minutes ticked by, the ship shuddered again, another impact from the Voidborn. Though this one was weaker, less precise. Vargo's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the creatures had noticed the disruption in the ship's systems. They were adapting, their energy signatures shifting like liquid shadows. "We're running out of time," Byrne called, her voice tinged with desperation. "If we don't get this power up soon, we'll be dead in the water." Vargo clenched her jaw, forcing her focus. "We have to make this work, whatever it takes." The bridge trembled again as another psychic wave from the Voidborn slammed into the ship. The crew winced, feeling the weight of it in their bones, their thoughts clouded by the alien force. But they pushed through, their focus tightening as they worked with an intensity born of desperation. Suddenly, Hayes straightened. "I've got it. Frequency locked in. I'm initiating the resonance charge now." Vargo held her breath as the ship hummed with power. The resonance generator flickered to life, its core glowing with a pale blue energy that seemed almost alive. It thrummed with a dangerous intensity, ready to strike. Then, without warning, a wave of pressure exploded outward from the vanguard. The air itself bent and warped as the resonance field activated. There was a violent, unnatural screech, a rippling sound like the fabric of reality itself being torn apart. The Voidborn outside paused, as if caught off guard. For a fleeting moment, Vargo saw their forms shift, flicker, and distort, as if the resonance had begun to unravel their very existence. It was working. But the relief was short-lived. The Voidborn were not so easily deterred. The sky outside the viewport turned black, and more shapes began to materialize, larger, more powerful. "We've only bought ourselves a few moments," Hayes shouted. Vargo clenched her fists, looking out at the enemy closing in. "Then let's make them count. Prepare for everything." Humanity might be outgunned and outmatched, but it would not go down without a fight. The battle for survival was far from over. The stellar vanguard groaned under the strain as the resonance field sputtered and flickered. It had worked, but only just. The Voidborn had been temporarily disrupted, their energy forms twisting in the wake of the feedback. The creatures had stopped their relentless assault for a brief moment, but it was only a temporary reprieve. Vargo could feel the ship trembling under the pressure, a constant reminder that they were fighting a battle not just for survival, but for their very souls. "We've only got a few minutes before they adapt," Hayes warned, her fingers flying over the console. "I can feel it. They're already shifting their resonance to counter our signal." "Then we'll hit them with everything we've got," Vargo said, her voice sharp with determination. "Prepare to fire any weapons we have left, and make sure all energy reserves are focused on the resonance generator. We need another pulse, stronger, more concentrated." Byrne was already at work, her face set in grim determination as she worked to channel what little power they had into the ship's remaining systems. "Weapons are still offline," she said, a thread of frustration in her voice. "But I'm routing power to the auxiliary engines and the generators. It's risky, but it'll give us just enough to make another pulse." Vargo nodded. "Do it." The crew moved with practiced precision, their minds focused on a single goal: to survive. The ship's humming resonated through the metal halls, like the heartbeat of a dying creature struggling to stay alive. Vargo stood at the center of the bridge, staring at the viewports as the abyss outside seemed to close in on them. The Voidborn were circling, their forms becoming clearer, more defined. But something was different this time. They weren't just watching anymore. "They're moving in," Lieutenant Rios called out from the communications station. "They're not just waiting to adapt. They're preparing for a full assault." Vargo's pulse quickened. They had only a few minutes before the Voidborn launched their next strike, and she needed to make sure that whatever happened, they were ready. "Everyone, brace yourselves," she commanded. "Prepare for the worst. If they come for us, we'll show them what humanity is capable of." The ship's lights flickered again, and the hum of the resonance generator grew louder, a low, pulsating thrum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Vargo could feel it in her chest, the power building, the pressure growing as the ship's systems neared their breaking point. The Voidborn outside the ship were now unmistakable. There were dozens of them, vast, shifting figures of shadow and light, their forms incomprehensible to human eyes. But Vargo knew one thing: they weren't just coming for the ship, they were coming for the crew. For her. They wanted to consume everything, every scrap of humanity. And that was something she would never allow. "Prepare the pulse," Vargo ordered. "Let's make them feel the cost of underestimating us." The crew worked together in tense synchrony, pushing the ship's systems beyond their limits. The resonance generator hummed louder, the core of it glowing a fierce, blinding blue. Hayes, her face drawn tight with concentration, gave a nod. "It's ready," she said, voice trembling but resolute. The view outside the vanguard was a swirling mass of shadows, the Voidborn's forms flickering as they closed in. Their eyes burned like twin suns, their movements sending ripples through the fabric of space around them. The ship was alone, stranded in the vast, empty chasm of the abyss, and the enemy was ready to strike. Vargo felt her heartbeat quicken, but she didn't flinch. This was it, the moment of truth. She was ready to sacrifice everything to ensure humanity's survival. "Firing in 3, Vargo called, her voice calm despite the storm raging around them. 2. Suddenly, The ship lurched. The entire bridge was thrown off balance as the force of the Voidborn's psychic assault slammed into them like a tidal wave. The walls shuddered, and Vargo's grip on the console tightened, her vision blurring as the pressure intensified. She could hear the crew's gasps as they fought to remain conscious, as the Voidborn's influence threatened to tear their minds apart. "Now," Vargo shouted, her voice hoarse. Hayes slammed the final command into the console, and the resonance generator fired. A massive, blinding pulse of energy shot out from the ship, a wave of force that rippled through space like the shockwave of an exploding star. The Voidborn, momentarily caught off guard, shrieked in fury as their forms distorted and flickered, their alien bodies twisting in ways that defied logic. For a moment, the abyss was still. Then, the Voidborn retaliated. A wave of crushing force collided with the stellar vanguard, sending the crew reeling. The ship's systems sputtered, sparks flying from consoles as the power cores screamed in protest. The resonance generator faltered, and Vargo could feel the ship's weakening heartbeat. They'd struck the Voidborn, but the cost had been high. "We've damaged them, but we're running out of time," Hayes yelled. "They're regrouping. They're not finished." The ship groaned as another impact reverberated through the hull. The lights dimmed, and the pressure of the Voidborn's presence began to rebuild. Vargo's mind raced. She had no illusions about the battle they were fighting. It was a war of attrition, a battle of wills, and the Voidborn were relentless. But they weren't invincible. Not yet. Vargo's voice rang out through the chaos. "Prepare for the next wave. If they want to destroy us, they'll have to earn it." Humanity's will was their greatest weapon, and Vargo wasn't about to let it be broken. The battle for survival had entered its final stage. The stellar vanguard was damaged, but its crew was unbroken. The stellar vanguard groaned under the brutal assault, its hull shuddering with every impact as the Voidborn's relentless onslaught intensified. The resonance pulse had disrupted their forms, but the victory had come at a cost. The ship's power systems were in freefall, lights flickering erratically, and every corridor hummed with the low thrum of failing systems. Vargo could hear the echoes of the battle reverberating through the walls, the faint cries of the crew struggling to hold on. "They're adapting too fast," Hayes shouted from the science console, her face a mask of exhaustion. "I can feel their resonance shifting with every second. Our pulse is barely holding them back." Vargo's hands gripped the edge of her command chair. She couldn't afford to lose hope. Not now. Not when everything they'd fought for was hanging in the balance. "Then we hit them harder," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "Burn, can we push any more power into the generators? We can't let them adapt again." Burn didn't even look up from her console, her fingers flying across the controls. "The power's already stretched thin," she replied, her voice strained. "Any more, and we'll lose life support and gravity control. We won't survive that long." Vargo's gaze swept across the bridge. The crew was battered, worn down by the constant pressure of the Voidborn's influence. Their minds were frayed from the psychic war, their bodies exhausted from the never-ending barrage. But there was still fire in their eyes. There was still humanity's defiance in every breath they took. "We won't give up," Vargo said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Prepare for the final pulse. We've got one shot at this." Hayes was already calculating. Her eyes darted back and forth between the data streams, the equations of life and death running through her mind like a whirlwind. "We need to target their central nexus. There's a weak point I've detected in their formation. If we can overload it with enough resonance, we might force them to retreat." Byrne's face paled, her hand shaking as she adjusted the power flow. "But if we miss, we'll collapse the ship. All systems will fail." Vargo didn't flinch. She'd seen what humanity could do when faced with impossible odds. It wasn't about the ship or the technology. It was about the will to fight. "We won't miss," she said firmly. Outside the viewport, the Voidborn were closing in, their massive forms shifting and warping as they encroached upon the vanguard. It was as if they were drawn by some ancient, malevolent instinct, sensing the vulnerability of their prey. But they didn't know the one thing that separated them from their human enemies. Humanity would fight until there was nothing left to fight for. Vargo's voice was steady as she addressed her crew. This is it, the final stand. We're going to show them what happens when they try to destroy us. We're going to make them regret ever coming to this part of the universe. The crew nodded, grim but resolute, their hands moving with practiced precision. The resonance generator hummed louder, its core glowing with the intense blue light of the final pulse, building to an explosive crescendo. Targeting the Voidborn's nexus, Hayes said, her voice taut with anticipation. We've got one chance. Ready when you are, Commander. Now, Vargo said, her words the only command that mattered. Fire. The resonance pulse blasted from the ship's core, a wave of energy that stretched out into the darkness like the hand of God reaching for the Voidborn. The moment it hit, the entire battlefield seemed to shift, space itself warping under the immense power of the pulse. The Voidborn shrieked, their forms rippling and distorting, their psychic hold on the vanguard weakening. Their central nexus, their very being, was hit with the full force of humanity's defiance. For a moment, everything was still. The pulse hung in the air like a silent promise. And then the Voidborn recoiled, their massive forms splintering into 1,000 shards of light and shadow. The massive pressure on the ship lifted, the weight of their psychic influence disappearing in an instant. The vanguard was free, at least for the moment. But the silence that followed was deafening. The crew stood frozen, staring at the viewport as the remnants of the Voidborn scattered into the abyss. They had done it. They had forced the Voidborn to retreat, at least for now. Vargo allowed herself a moment of relief, but only a moment. She knew the battle wasn't truly over. The Voidborn might retreat, but they were not defeated. They would return. And next time, they would bring even more power, even more force. But there was something the Voidborn hadn't counted on. Humanity's ability to endure, to survive, to fight when all seemed lost. The vanguard was broken, its systems barely functioning, but its crew was unbowed. And that was something no enemy could truly destroy. We've won this battle, Vargo said, her voice steady. But we won't stop until the Voidborn are gone from our galaxy. We'll rebuild, we'll recover, and we'll be ready. Her crew, battered but unbroken, nodded in agreement. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges they faced would only grow harder. But one thing was certain. Humanity's fight for survival was far from over. And they would not surrender. Not now. Not ever. The silence in the aftermath was almost unbearable. The stellar vanguard drifted in the void, battered and broken, but still alive. The crew, their bodies and minds pushed to the limit, stood at their posts in stunned silence. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the war was over, as if the darkness that had threatened to swallow them whole had been repelled. The Voidborn, their psychic hold broken, scattered into the abyss, retreating like shadows into the black. But Vargo knew better than to believe the battle was truly won. She stood at the center of the bridge, staring out at the remnants of the battle. The stars, once obscured by the Voidborn's oppressive presence, now shone dimly in the distance. But there was something different about them. A glimmer of hope, a beacon that hadn't been there before. The Voidborn are gone. For now, Hayes said quietly, her voice tinged with both relief and uncertainty. But their retreat is temporary. They'll regroup. They'll come back stronger. Vargo's eyes hardened as she turned to face her crew. They were exhausted, bruised, and some of them had already lost consciousness from the strain of the battle. But there was no giving up. Not now. We've bought ourselves time, Vargo replied, her voice steady and filled with determination. We've made them feel the cost of underestimating us, and that will give us the edge when they come again. Lieutenant Byrne, though pale from the battle's toll, managed a small, weary smile. If we can rebuild, and I think we can, with what we've got left, we can prepare for what's coming. We've learned from this. We know what they're capable of. We'll rebuild, Vargo agreed. We'll take what we've learned and make sure we're ready. The Voidborn won't stop until they've destroyed everything they can. But we're not like them. We won't be consumed. Not by them, and not by the void. She turned back to the viewport. The abyss was still there, an ever-present, ever-looming reminder of what humanity had just survived. But it was also a reminder of the strength that had allowed them to endure. The Voidborn were not just another alien threat. They were an existential nightmare, a force capable of unmaking entire civilizations. Yet humanity had faced them down, and for now, at least humanity had won. There's a long road ahead, Vargo said, her gaze hardening. We'll need every scrap of our ingenuity, every ounce of our resilience to face them again. But if there's one thing I know, it's that humans don't give up. We never have. Rios, the communications officer, cleared his throat. We've got a message, Commander. It's from the fleet. Vargo stepped over to Rios, her heart skipping a beat. The fleet. They had been scattered in the wake of the Voidborn's initial assault, their communication lines severed, and their forces crippled. To hear from them now, after everything, was a sign. It was a sign that humanity was not truly alone. She nodded, and Rios activated the transmission. A holographic image flickered to life on the bridge. A stern face, weathered and tired, but filled with purpose. Admiral Horn, the leader of the fleet, appeared on the screen. Commander Vargo, Horn's voice crackled through the static. We've heard of your victory. We've lost a lot. But you've shown the galaxy something they didn't expect from humanity. A will to survive. A refusal to bow. Vargo stood tall, looking directly at the Admiral. We haven't won yet, but we'll fight until we do. We'll support you, Horn said firmly. We're regrouping and rallying all remaining forces. But we need a plan, Vargo. We need to unite and strike back before they can consolidate their forces. Vargo nodded, her eyes narrowing. We'll need time, but I have an idea. We've learned a lot about the Voidborn's weaknesses. This won't be the last time we fight them. We'll make sure the next battle is on our terms. Horn's image flickered but remained steady. I'll start coordinating with the other fleets. You focus on rebuilding the Vanguard and getting your people ready. We'll need every advantage we can get when the Voidborn return. The transmission ended, and the bridge fell into a tense silence. For a brief moment, the weight of everything that had happened, the destruction, the loss, the victory, hung in the air. But Vargo knew what had to come next. There was no time for mourning. The war was far from over. All right, everyone, Vargo said, her voice resolute. We've bought ourselves time. Now we prepare. We rebuild. We fight. And we win. The crew nodded, some of them visibly exhausted, others quietly steeling themselves for the work ahead. Vargo took a deep breath, her heart steady and strong. She'd seen what humanity was capable of, how it rose from the ashes, how it defied the impossible. And she knew that this fight, the war against the Voidborn, wasn't just about saving humanity. It was about proving, once and for all, that humanity could stand against any force that sought to consume it. And if the Voidborn wanted to bring an end to humanity, they would have to do more than invade. They'd have to break humanity's spirit. But that was something no one, no matter how powerful, could ever truly destroy.